All right, hello. Today we're going to be talking about neurology and the acquisition of language. So we're going to be talking about how language works in the brain as well as how we learn it, both our first language and our second language. Let's get started with neurology. So first we have to start out with the brain. We have a few different ways of thinking of the brain. The brain is kind of an amazing and difficult to understand thing that we all live with, but is hard to talk about. There are a lot of analogies out there for brains. Sometimes we think of it as a switchboard, connecting different pieces together. We think of it as a computer where you put in information and get other information out. Think of it maybe like a symphony orchestra. There are lots of different parts that are acting separately, but under the direction of some central authority. And then finally, well, not finally, but close to finally, we have the inside-out model, where there's a whole wondrous world inside the brain, but it's really being guided by a few primary agents. Finally, it's possible that none of these are very apt, and will, as we learn more about the brain, we'll have a better analogy in the future. The brain is made up of neurons. Neurons are permanent brain cells. We have about 20 billion in the average human brain. When they a neuron firing is due to a buildup of ions in the cell body until it leads to an action potential. Once it reaches that threshold, an electrical signal, which is really just a batch of charged ions, zips down the axon to the synapses. At that point, neurotransmitters are pushed across the synapses onto a new cell's dendrites. The information in these firings comes from a couple different measurements. One is just the specific neurotransmitters involved. One is the rate. It's either slower or faster as a rate of firing. And each neuron could have an excitatory or an inhibitory effect on the next neuron in the chain. So that's where the information comes from. Activation is what comes up a lot when we're talking about language. Basically, neurons act in groups and networks. That means that individual neurons can be connected to certain processing roles in some situations, but by and large, most activity goes on in groups of networks and bunches of neurons. Different areas of the brain connect to each other, and especially memories are made up of connected activations between different bundles of neurons. Over on the right, you can see a nice animation of a thought in a fish's brain. So you see the light stimulus on the side, and you can see the analogous activation in the fish brain in the center there. It's pretty cool. Brain is divided up into a few lobes, 4 major lobes, and then the cerebellum and brainstem. First of all, the occipital lobe is what does visual processing. This is important for reading and reading lips. It processes basically all the information we get through our eyes. Secondly, we have the parietal lobe. That's a kind of top back of your brain. This deals with sensory information, touch, your orientation in space. This also deals with higher order types of motor control. Next, we have the temporal lobe. This is auditory processing. So information comes in from your ears. Also, it deals with memories, emotions, and some of those other higher functions. The frontal lobe is all higher order functions. So this is our attention, planning, abstract reasoning. The frontal lobe is really what makes us human. Most intelligent animals have these other lobes, but barely have any frontal lobe. Humans have a huge frontal lobe, which is why we're so smart. Also, at the bottom of the brain, we have the cerebellum and brainstem. This is basically our very basic motor control and homeostasis functions. This keeps our heart beating. This keeps our liver doing the things livers do. But not much when it comes to language, especially. This also, for animals that have very, very low brain function, they will typically just have a cerebellum and brain stem, and very little other very little neurology beyond that. Now, our language areas, we have three major ones here. These are our primary ones. We have Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe on the dominant hemisphere. So if you're right-handed, that'll be your left hemisphere, and vice versa. This is primarily doing language production. And this area was discovered because Dr. Broca found that people with damage to this area had aphasia. They had halting telegraphic speech, where they were only able to produce some words and had a lot of trouble finding the right word. Broca famously had a patient that they kind of cruelly called tan, because the only word he could really get out was the word tan. So just say tan, tan, tan over and over again. Next we have Wernicke's area. This is on the temporal lobe. On the dominant hemisphere, again, so that's left hemisphere if you're right-handed, vice versa. This also involves language production, and damage also causes aphasia, but this is very fluent speech that's incoherent. So it's very fast, it's very comfortable, but it doesn't make any sense. So people with Wernicke's aphasia tend to have be very comfortable at talking, but very bad at being understood. Finally, the angular gyrus, a little further back and up, is in our parietal lobe, and there are actually structures in both hemispheres, not just the dominant. This arranges more complex language as well as some mathematical functions, and damage to it causes dysgraphia, which is trouble writing. We also have some secondary areas. So each of your Broca's area and Wernicke's area have non-dominant hemisphere analogs, so the same space on the other side of the brain, are also involved with language, but are more involved with the logic of language, so they help you tie together discourse, like events sequencing in a story, as well as just making sense of a conversation. Finally, we have the frontal lobe, which does a lot of our coherent, it organizes a lot of meaning into coherence. It also is where your ego is involved with language, so your ability to talk and think about yourself is comes from the frontal lobe. Like I said, that's where we get our planning, we get our general intelligence, so it makes sense that that's going to be the center of our logic center. So that's our basic picture of the brain and how it interacts with language. Let's get into language acquisition. We'll start with the first language acquisition. So there have been several theories of first language acquisition over the years. We're going to focus on these two for now. The first one is the innateness theory, and the second one is the active construction theory. These have different terms, and different people prefer different terms, but basically the innateness theory says that we have a built-in language learning mechanism in our brain tied to the idea of universal grammar that activates and guides the learner in learning their first language. So basically when we're babies, a switch gets flipped on in our brains and we get really, really good at learning languages, and then over time that switch doesn't get switched off, but definitely gets dialed down a little bit. Similarly, or on the other hand, there's the active construction theory, which is basically that children are little scientists that are figuring out language just the same way that they figure out all of the other cultural knowledge that they need in the world. So these have pros and cons. The pros side of nativism, of innateness, is that each learner of an L1 really does seem to learn language really well to an extreme level of detail. And the analogy to this is sometimes walking, where most children are not explicitly taught how to walk or how to speak their first language. They just pick it up because they're naturally inclined to do it. The con to this, the problem with this theory and why it has gotten some criticism, is that we have no idea where this mechanism is. What's happening in our brain here that this switch gets flipped on? Where is the switch? Where is this this module in our brain? Hasn't been found yet, and it's not really clear what it would look like. When we get to the active construction theory, the reasons to like this is that this theory does represent pretty well the language acquisition process and the empiricism that seems to be present in it. So we see children, as they're learning their first language, do a lot of experimenting. They make mistakes. They make rules that they overgeneralize or undergeneralize, and so you tend to see an empirical process there, and there's an appeal to the idea that the entire process is empirical. On the con side, though, this can often get reduced just to behaviorism or simple conditioning, like that we're learning language like rats in a maze, getting little pieces of cheese and getting better at language. It seems like language is a little too complex for that simple an explanation. So this is a debate that is still ongoing. There are different factions that are very rude to each other, but that's academia. Let's look at the timeline for learning our first language. So at 4 months, we can distinguish different phonemes. You can tell the difference between ba and ga, da, do, and all of those different phonemes we can distinguish. At 6 months, a child starts babbling phones and phonemes. This is when you hear ba, 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 ga, ga, ma, ma, da, da. At 12 months, a kid can recognize some words and string together some simple phrases. By 18 months, a child will typically have a countable repertoire of words. So distinct words that are clear and a significant number. 2 years, we're up to about 50 words. And between 2.5 and 3 years, you get an absolute explosion of vocabulary. Go from about 50 words to 1,000 or more. Also during this time, this is when kids get frustrated when adults don't understand them. They know that they should be able to communicate better than they're currently able to, and this is kind of when you see empiricism in its finest, because you see kids really doing a lot of trial and error to get their ideas across. By 4 years old, kids have a really well-established language, and the mistakes they tend to make are more with either really complex, or the mistakes they make are either with vocabulary, words that they're still learning, they don't know yet, but they're still learning, or they're using inappropriate style, register, and grammar. They're going to say, "What's up, dude?" to a police officer, which is not grammatically incorrect, but it might not be the right stylistic or registral or pragmatic choice. Our last step in the timeline is basically puberty, and this is when first language acquisition processes really close up shop. And after this point, it means that this module that is in your brain that learns languages extremely well is basically finished, and you have to resort to your higher order brain functions to learn a new language. It's still very possible, but this is what's called the critical period, and it's over around puberty. This leads to the kind of unusual situation where in second language research, adults is the term for anyone over about 12 or 13, because they're after this critical period. Yeah, that's our basic timeline. We'll get into some of the processes that are going on here. So one thing is intake. What can children actually hear as they're learning their first language? They can categorize stops. So this is ba, da, ga, ka, ta, and pa. They can categorize these at 1 to 4 months. So very early on, before they're really doing much of anything else, they can distinguish different languages, especially languages with different rhythmic structures from their L1. So they'll recognize a language with different rhythmic structure. They'll recognize that that's different, that that's not their normal language before 5 months. Can also learn new phonotactic rules and tell when they're being broken. All of this sounds very unlikely for a tiny baby to understand, but we can tell by basically by measuring their gaze, what they're looking at, and their sucking patterns. So they tend to follow things with their eyes or suck on a bottle. They tend to do that more when something is new and interesting, and less when nothing is new or interesting. So when they're hearing a new sound or they're hearing something new, they tend to suck more and faster. They tend to follow that thing with their eyes. So we can actually surmise a fair amount from these methods. As they're learning phonology, typical order of phonology, they tend to learn these simple categories of segments first. So principal vowels, these are our extreme ones, our high front E, high back rounded U, low A, or sorry, low A. Our stops, P, B, K, G, T, D, and our glides, Y and W. These are the simplest segments to pronounce, and these are the first ones that babies produce. After that, we go on to simple consonants and simple syllable structure. So we start with consonant vowel combinations, ba, ga, bi, gi, ti, di, and finally, after some of that, we get to more complex syllables. So bat, kat, so consonant, vowel, consonant. It takes some time after that to get to our consonant clusters like ST or STR or STS. Those consonant clusters that are comfortable for native speakers, but not so easy for babies and often for non-native speakers. Also talk about the way that babies build morphology and grammar. So Roger Brown laid out an order of acquisition for English morphology that babies learn. They tend to learn the ing first, then they learn on and in, and go on from there to learn a fair number of other inflections and grammatical or morphological combinations. And as you go through this list, think about these two main concepts that we're going to come back to, and they are markedness. This is also referred to as salience. The idea here is that some morphemes are easier to hear and notice than others. If we think about ing, this one's really easy to hear. It's a separate syllable. It's kind of an unusual sound in English. If it weren't for the ing ending, the ng would be a very unusual sound in English. So that ing is very noticeable. Whereas, say, the final s, like in plural possessive or third person singular, these are not very easy to hear. When you think about boats or rugs, you know, that final S is not very easy to hear, and it gets missed a lot if you're not listening for it. We also have the idea of complexity. How complex is this concept? So our ing is a pretty simple concept. If it's happening right now, it's ing. Running. When you think about baby speech or small child speech, they might leave out that copula, like I am running, the contractible or uncontractable copula, so am. But you'll hear kids say all the time, I running. They understand the concept. The concept is pretty simple, that it's happening right now. So that ing is a perfect mix of being very marked and being not very complex as a concept. As you go down the list, you'll notice that these get harder to hear and more complex in the grammatical requirements. So when we get down to the contractible auxiliary, I've been to the store already today. That it's hard to hear. It gets left off a lot in casual speech. I've been there already. And it's somewhat of a complex form, and it's not clear why it's necessary in that situation. So that's two ways of measuring how likely a morpheme is to be acquired and in what order it is. Kids also have a couple ways of building grammar. Most kids do both as they go along. First, here is the word combining strategy. It starts with the one-word stage. This is our 12 to 18-month stage. And this is just, kids are just saying one word at a time, mostly nouns, verbs, adjectives, a handful of adverbs, and a lot of names. These are often accompanied with gestures. So mommy, doggy, run, swim, those kinds of things. Then they'll move into the two-word stage. And with the two-word stage, you can start to kind of build a little mini grammar of the two-word utterances. These are still mostly nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and names. We sometimes get a preposition or two here, but it's mostly those key open class categories. And the grammar is not a grammar as we think of it in syntax, but it's a grammar that connects different semantic relationships. So we have some examples here. We have agent in action, so the thing doing the action and then the action. Baby sleep, doggy run. We have action and object, kick ball, eat pizza. Action and location, sit chair, run park. Entity and location, teddy chair, doggy pool. Possessor and possession, mommy book, me hat. Entity and attribute, block red, doggy fuzzy. And demonstrative and entity, this shoe, that dog. So kids are starting to build regular utterances during this time, even though they don't really have the morphology to put together fully grammatical sentences in English. You can tell that they're wanting to follow rules. They just don't have all the tools to follow those rules yet. They also will employ whole phrase strategies, relying on phrases that they hear very often. These are often learned as chunks or formulas. They might not fully understand that these are broken into separate words. A good example is gimme. Kids may not figure out that gimme means give me. They might just think it means I want or something like that. So in some cases they do actually carry grammatical information, but the kid may not be able to alter it, may not be able to use it for new and novel situations. So pick it up, they might learn pick it up, but they might not be able to put something else in the place of it there. Just pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. A is B, but not to be. The soup is hot, but not too hot. You might learn that formula, but not be able to alter it in fully grammatical ways. Pragmatic formulas are also very common, so kids will learn phrases like thank you, you're welcome, guess what, and be able to use those often before they can really use them creatively in a novel context. Our final area here we're going to talk about is word meaning development in L1. As kids learn new words, they go through several steps. The first one is jargon step. Let's listen to this kid in the jargon stage. All right. So I think you get the idea here. Basically, the kid has a lot to say, but doesn't have any of the words or morphology to say that. So jargon is when kids will mimic the patterns and intonations and rhythms of natural speech, but not have any actual ability to say anything relevant. So you can see here, she's performing language, but she's not actually producing any language. So that's jargon. Next, we'll get on to proto-words. Proto-words are invented words for apparent concepts. So this example comes from a linguist's own experience with his child. And the kid would refer to anything round is eo, eo, eo. They could refer to wheels, knobs, the eyes on the teddy bears and stuffed animals and things like that. Anything round was eo, eo, eo. Presumably the kid learned the word round later on, but recognized or felt that would be a good symbol. That combination of sounds would be a good sign for that concept. As kids get a little older, they are able to understand and adopt new words and fit those into their existing morphology. So we'll look at Jean Berco's work here. This is a very classic study, so we'll watch this short video and see her experience.
So I'm here with Jean Berco Gleason, and she's going to administer the WUG test on me to see if I am smarter than a child.
This is a WUG, okay? Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two
WUGs.
WUGs is good, and even very young children would say WUGs. What would you call a very tiny WUG?
A WUGette.
WUGette is a very good adult answer. Adults say WUGette, wuggling, wuggy. Young kids don't. They all say quite uniformly, baby WUG. This is a man who knows how to zib. What is he doing? He is
zibbing.
Zibbing. That's the progressive form of the verb. You got it, and every kid gets it too. What would you call a man whose job is to zib?
A zibber.
Zibber is a good adult answer. Adults know that ending, like bake, baker. Young kids don't know that. They uniformly say he's a zib man. You pass. You have adult-like control of the English morphological inflectional system.
All right, so that's a nice picture there of the WUG test. It's a classic in linguistics. So anybody will know the WUG test out there, and it's kind of an interesting insight into the way that our minds continue understanding morphology as we get older. Even if we're fine with basic inflection, derivational inflection still develops over time. So common errors that kids make. One is overextension. This is typically using one word for too big of a category. So kids might learn the word cookie is something delicious, but they might use it to refer to any dessert, not just cookies. Maybe also to crackers, maybe also to candy, or all cookies. A kid might learn the word fly, but apply it to any small thing that might fly around, or just small thing that might be around. Similarly, kids can have problems with underextension. So this is an old experiment where they ask kids which one of these cartoons shows a woman filling a cup. And the top one you can see the cup being filled. Clearly she filled the cup, but in the bottom one, she did the more recognizable action of picking up a pitcher and filling a cup, even though there's no water in the cup. So kids might only think about filling as the act of picking up a container and pouring it into another one. So in this case, they've underextended the idea of fill. Kids also might have problems with complexive concepts. This is basically where they're applying a name for the wrong set of attributes. So they might refer to both of these entities in the picture as teddies or puppies, even though they're very different types of things. They have a lot of the same features. Similarly, they might have trouble with relational terms, talking about the big dog and little elephant that are the same size. Might have some trouble with those kind of scalable adjectives in those cases. So for each of the words below, we'll walk through what a kid needs to master to learn it and what potential pitfalls they might encounter. So our first one, cold. This is a gradable adjective. So a cold drink might not have the same meaning as a cold day or cold swimming pool. A cold swimming pool is probably a good deal warmer than a cold drink, and much warmer than a cold winter's day. So kids might have some trouble with those. Susan might be the name of more than one woman or more than one person in a kid's life, and a kid might associate with just one person or with all people with a certain role in the kid's life. So maybe if they have a teacher named Susan, they think Susan means teacher, not just this particular teacher, Susan. You is a deictic word, so it's different depending on who's saying you. So kids might have trouble with that. They might also have trouble pulling you out of formulaic phrases that they've heard and that they've learned. A bird can be overextended to any flying thing. Can also be underextended to exclude birds like penguins or ostriches or other kinds of non-prototypical birds. And finally we have drink. Drink can be underextended to just a very obvious drinking motion of picking up a cup or something like that, rather than just taking in liquid. These are all possible. They've all been documented with kids in the past. Now for a little bit of a little more fun exercise here. For each of these phrases from childlike speech, guess what it might mean. Let's take a second and think through all of these. So here are the contexts that they come from. Snow car is a car that's been painted white. A running stick is a stick that you run with. Water cake, and this, it seems to be, looks maybe like it's soap suds in a bathtub. Finger brush is a brush for cleaning your nails. And a pony kid is a kid who rides ponies, obviously. So, kids will have their own kind of logic when it comes to combining words that might not be totally obvious to adults, but they're still working out rules and working out expectations when it comes to language. So one example of a study in this was from Imai, Gentner, and Uchida, which looked at 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and college undergraduates. Those were the control group, presumably. And presumably they would have more adult-like intuitions about language choices. And they would ask, they'd show the participant the birthday cake over here, and then ask them to say that this is a FEP, and then ask the kids to find another FEP. And maybe they would say the taxonomic FEP here, taxonomic related word. It's related in that it's a dessert. We have a shape, similar shape, which is top hat, but no other real relation. And then thematic relation, which is something that is also found at a birthday party. So all of those are feppish in that way. By and large, 3-year-olds would rely on shape. They were more likely to say the top hat because it's fep-shaped. But as people got older, even the 5-year-olds were more likely to say, more likely to assume that it's fep would mean something like dessert, something in the same category, rather than something around the same theme or something of the same shape. All right, so that's it. We'll get on to second language acquisition. And as we think about second language acquisition, I want you to think about differences between first and second language acquisition. So which L1 acquisition challenges do L2 learners also have? Which ones do they avoid? And which challenges do L2 learners have that L1 people avoid, L1 learners avoid? Give you a second. So L1 and L2 learners both have issues with over and under generalization. They omit words. They have trouble learning all of those little function words, or at least it takes them time. And they have the potential to over-rely on formulas. L1 learners or L2 learners don't need to worry as much about the 2-word stage. It's not typical that an beginner level language class for adults, you wouldn't have to worry about saying, dog running or this kitty. They can avoid that stage, at least as a long-term stage. And then finally, L2 learners don't need to also learn literacy. L2 learners, most L2 learners do come to language with some familiarity with reading and writing, although obviously not all do, but most, or many do. But no, nobody learns their first language through reading and writing. L2 acquisition challenges that L1 learners avoid is mostly transfer, and we'll talk about that in some detail. So L1 does have this critical period, although some people do consider it more of a sensitive period. This is because you don't want to make it sound like you can't learn a second language. You can learn a second language, it's just different processes. So some people like to call it the sensitive period. L1 learning is driven by universal grammar, but the role of universal grammar in adult language acquisition, L2 acquisition, has a hot debate under it. So I can't tell you anything too certain here because linguist police will come after me. So L1, there are lots of things in our L1 that are hard to change for the L2. So I'll just run down a list of them here. Phonology, we have different categorizations of phonemes. Look at some examples of that. Phonotactic rules are different. Intonation rules and expectations are different. Our morphology is different. We have to relearn how to connect different ideas. Syntax will be different and sometimes have totally different organizations between two different languages. Sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're totally different. The semantics will be different. Sometimes this even manifests in basic categories like colors. Our vocabulary tends to be obviously different, and there are also different formulas that will need to be learned, also idioms and other expressions like that. Pragmatic expectations are different, how to deal with politeness, and even some thought processes are different, particularly what is marked. So in some languages, gender or relationships between people is marked in a way that you don't have to think about in other languages. So let's get into specifics of some of the concepts here. One big concept here is the concept of transfer or language interference or cross-linguistic interference. It has a lot of names. Basically, this means that your knowledge of one language affects your performance in another language. This usually goes from L1 to L2, but it can actually go the opposite way in some situations. We also have the theory of interlanguage, which is basically a language or some kind of symbolic system in your mind that helps you translate between two languages. It's really hard to observe this, so there's not a ton of research on it, but you might have felt yourself in this situation where you've developed some kind of code in your own head to translate between two different languages. So we'll talk about transfer mostly here, also known as cross-linguistic interference or language interference. And basically, typically goes from L1 to L2. So in this way, L2 acquisition, second language acquisition, is actually a little bit more like adapting your prior language skills than learning totally new language skills. We very often learn our second language in terms of our first one until it becomes more natural. So we'll look at some examples of L2 phonology considerations. So there's a need to shift prototypes. Remember our example here, Tom Burton tried to steal a butter plate. Our prototype of D includes a lot of, or allows for a lot of different allophones of T to be acceptable that would not be acceptable in other languages. In other languages, a T cannot become a D sound, as in butter. And that sounds very confusing to some learners of English. Also, phonotactic rules shift. So when the English word control gets borrowed into Japanese, those sounds cannot necessarily go together. So they add an extra vowel in between the T and R, control, and then that final L can't work as an L, so they change it to an R sound also and add an U at the end because they can't end a syllable on an L sound. So control goes to controlu. All right, so those rules change, both phonology and phonotactic rules change. Morphology and syntax will change. So a learner might need to learn different rules for inflection and agreement. In Arabic, for example, you would say the green, the books, or actually the books, the green, because the definite article the goes on to both adjectives and nouns to show agreement. Also, many languages do inflect negative markers or helping verbs, so something like I didn't saw the movie would be a common mistake because in a person's first language, rules for inflection are different. Word order expectations comes up when learning new syntax. So subject, object, verb versus subject, verb to object languages will lead learners to put things in the wrong order. Also, head first and head last rules. You may know from Spanish that adjectives very often go after the nouns, but it's not the case in English. So you'll get some learners of English saying things like the book's green because they're using the L1 rules in their L2. Same thing happens with semantics. So we have overextensions and underextensions like we talked about with kids. There's also the danger of false friends, words that look like cognates but are not actually cognates. You may know the one from Spanish, embarazada. Does not mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. So you got to be careful with that one. Also, idiomatic expressions. These are phrases with meanings that are unrecognizable from their literal meanings. Each language has these, but they're different in every language, so a learner might try to just directly translate them in a way that is not really valid or meaningful in the new language. So a couple examples: have a chip on one shoulder, or I can't quite make the sign out. To make out there would not work if you translated directly into many other languages. Finally, we have some change in conceptualization. So we'll talk about description of motion in an L2. So in some languages, let's see, sorry, in this study, they looked at Turkish people that came to Germany to study, and in some cases live permanently, and they interviewed some people in Germany, some that had returned to Turkey, and compared both of their performance in German with monolingual German speakers, and showed people simple comics like this to describe the action. So in this case, they'd have them read the comic, write a short paragraph describing the action in both languages. In this case, they were mostly comparing German, but they also found some interesting features in the Turkish as well. And what they're looking at is basically the distinction between path and manner verbs. So manner verbs are words like run, hop, jump, walk, crawl. They describe how an action, how movement was done, whereas path verbs describe the path that it took. So enter, exit, and so forth. So English is a language that relies mostly on manner verbs, whereas, say, Spanish will rely more on path verbs. English and German both prefer these manner verbs. They encode the path outside the verb. They're called satellite-framed languages. Whereas verb-framed languages, like Spanish and Turkish, tend to use words like entered, exit, and are considered verb-framed languages. So in this study, they found that Turkish people started in Turkish tended to use, with lower levels of German, tended to use more path verbs in describing these scenes, whereas while their German improved, they acted more German-like in their production of German, so they ended up using more and more manner verbs, and then this tendency even bled into their performance in Turkish. They tended to start using more manner verbs in Turkish and in German as their German proficiency went up. This also happened with goal and action sequencing, but it's another way of conceptualizing movement, or at least describing movement and encoding it in language that changed over the course of their acquisition of German. There are also non-linguistic factors when it comes to learning a second language. So the first one, and the one that gets kind of the most attention, is age. So it is not impossible for older people to learn a new language. It is very possible. And in some cases, they can actually learn faster if they have effort and motivation, but they can't harness that natural acquisition process as easily. So it's a lot more about motivation and affect. And affect is the idea of how basically your feeling affects your ability to learn. And as an adult, if you are speaking a language and you feel like an idiot because you're unable to understand things, you're unable to express things, then you can really get into a low state of motivation and make it really hard for you to learn language just because you really don't want to. You don't like the process. So in a lot of cases, when adults don't feel like they can learn a language, really they don't feel motivated enough to push through that unpleasant feeling of feeling stupid. There are also cultural factors with learning a language. Some language communities make it very welcoming and easy. Some language communities make it very difficult to learn that language and enter that language-speaking community. So there are a lot of other cultural and personal factors that can come up, and psychological factors that come up in the process. But remember that older people, adults, can learn a new language. It just takes a different process than it does for little kids. So, what's this have to do with teaching? You know, what you need to do as a teacher is take advantage of these positive aspects of L2 learning. So motivation is a big one. Also self-discipline. These are features that adults have that kids tend not to have. Also literacy. The fact that people come in already able to read and write in a lot of cases makes it a lot easier for them to engage with new language. And then also mitigate the disadvantages that they have. So if you know what the L1 transfer patterns are going to be because they're coming from Spanish, you know that they're going to reverse word order and put adjectives after nouns. You know that they're going to have trouble having consonant clusters at the end of syllables. So directly address those. Also, encourage learners to step outside of their comfort zones. The more they get out there, the more they put themselves out there and risk feeling silly, the more progress they're going to make in their new language. So these are ways that you can take very basic ideas from language acquisition research to lead to better teaching. So that's it for today. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. But I think the work you've been doing so far has been really good. So I hope to hear from you if you have questions, or if you're happy, or hope to hear from you in general. That's it, and I'll talk to you again soon.